Okay, good morning again. I am going to move quickly on to our next event on the agenda. And this will be talking about basically the science behind Lake Erie. And again, as I mentioned, the agenda today builds, every session builds a little bit more. So I'd like to bring up front our next two presenters, Dr. Jeff Reuter and Dr. Bob Heath. And I will begin with their bios quickly as they move forward. Dr. Reuter began working on Lake Erie in 1971 and has directed 4 programs at Ohio State University since 1987. F.T. Stone Laboratory, the Ohio Sea Grant College Program, the Center for Lake Erie Research, and the Great Lakes Aquatic Ecosystem Research Consortium, which is a consortium of top scientists at 12 Ohio colleges. He received his Bachelor of Science and Master of Science from Ohio State in Fisheries Management and his PhD from Ohio State in Environmental Biology. Dr. Reuter is an aquatic biologist and limnologist, which I had to look up the other day, I admit. The author of over 150 technical reports and journal articles, and a frequent lecturer on issues related to the changing Lake Erie ecosystem, harmful algal blooms, nutrient loading, aquatic invasive species, linking environmental health and coastal economic development. While at OSU, he has aided in the development of 20 endowments and supported over 2,000 students with scholarships, fellowships, and employment opportunities. And I will say I had the opportunity a few weeks ago to travel up to Gibraltar Island, which is just off Put-in Bay, to attend one of his lectures with his students there for the summer. And it was really fantastic. I had never been to Gibraltar Island. Unfortunately, of course, I had to leave early to catch the last ferry back to Catawba Island. But nonetheless, I highly recommend, if you're interested to make the trip up there. It's really quite lovely. And joining him at the presentation today is Dr. Bob Heath. He is a professor emeritus of biological sciences at Kent State University. He has conducted research on the Great Lakes, their wetlands and tributaries for 40 years. The focus of his research has been on nutrient impact on algal growth and on the significance of the microbial food web, largely in Lake Erie. He is past president of the International Association for Great Lakes Research. He is the vice chairman of the Ohio Coastal Resources Advisory Council and is currently on the board of directors of the Alliance for Water Future and the Maumee River Foundation. He also serves on the advisory panel of the Generation Foundation. So, bringing forward Dr. Jeff Reuter.
Thanks very much, Jennifer. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm going to have to move very rapidly through this. There's no way in about 20 minutes I can tell you everything there is to know about, the history of Lake Erie, its current state, and where we're headed. At the same time, by the time I'm done with all these slides, you probably think I did. But believe me, there's a lot of information that we just simply can't cover. However, with what I lay out for you with this initial talk, it ought to allow you to make more sense of what Dr. Heath has to say next. Bob and I have worked together for many, many years. And I also really want to let you know how much I support what you're trying to do, what Mr. Fitzgerald is trying to do with this LakeStat initiative within Cuyahoga County. Within the last couple of weeks, I've probably spoken 10 times to different audiences, from charter captains to coastal county commissioners, mayors, and next week it'll be legislators. We have special days for Congress. We have special days for the legislature. But last was our 6th day focused on coastal county commissioners, mayors, and decision makers, and we had 82 people out at the island because we really feel that when it comes to putting things into action, putting the boots on the ground, it's going to happen within the counties and within the cities along the shoreline. And we want to try to influence policy, so I really support what you're trying to do here in Cuyahoga County. It's also an area I grew up in, so it's always fun to come back. I was able to skip over this because Jennifer said it all. So real quickly, Lake Erie is the southernmost of the Great Lakes. Keep that in mind as we look at it. If you look at it in cross-section, it's also the shallowest of the Great Lakes. The other lakes are all over 750 feet deep, Lake Erie 210 feet at the max. So if you think about southernmost and shallowest, it has to be the warmest. And if we now look at Lake Erie in cross-section, you can see that western basin west of Sandusky, extremely shallow, averaged up 24 feet. And keep in mind how small that basin is by volume as we move forward. And the retention time for water in Lake Erie is about 2.6, 2.7 years. But because of the size of the western basin, the retention time for water in the western basin is about 20 to 50 days. Also note the red line that's on there. The red line is the thermocline. Typically that thermocline forms 50 feet from the surface. The deep spot in the lake is right about where B and Eastern Basin is located, so that's in New York, Ontario waters. The Central Basin is between Presque Isle and Sandusky. Average depth in the Central Basin, 60 feet. That red line, the thermocline, forms in the spring when you have essentially a layering of the lake with warm water on top, cold water on the bottom. It breaks up in the fall when the lake cools. Between times, it's possible to use all of the oxygen within that cold bottom layer in the Central Basin. You notice there's seldom a thermocline in the Western Basin, and in the Eastern Basin, there's a whole lot of water underneath the thermocline. But right where you guys are right here, there's only about 10 feet of water. Average depth of the Central Basin here is 60 feet, and the thermocline forms 50 feet from the surface. So there's a very small amount of water underneath it. In the summer, when we use it all up, that's the dead zone. Keep that in mind, because when we use up all the oxygen, the chemistry within that Central Basin cold bottom layer changes and allows the sediment to release phosphorus, release nutrients, and also metals, which you've probably seen if you're dealing with a water treatment plant. Bob will talk more about that. Recognize that the surface of the lake is seldom flat like that. You know, here in Cleveland, you don't recognize what we would call wind setup or the sesh, the wave that runs from Toledo to Buffalo. But essentially, when we have a strong northeast wind, the water piles up in Toledo. And when we have a strong southwest wind, the water piles up in Buffalo. And we've seen as much as a 14-foot difference in water level between Toledo and Buffalo. So these are significant. And you get that kind of a wave, that volume of water, first flushing into the Western Basin, then flushing out of the Western Basin. And to think about it, the Maumee River at Toledo flows backwards 30% of the time because of that flow going into that river. That amount of water moving at the surface has a big impact on the hypolimnion, so the hypo has a big impact on the thermocline and the cold bottom layer, and that thermocline will pop up and sometimes reach the surface. Dr. Heath will probably talk a little bit about that. Also take a look quickly at the watersheds around the lakes, and Lake Erie's watershed is very different from the other 4 Great Lakes. Those watersheds are dominated primarily by forest ecosystems, whereas the Lake Erie watershed is dominated by an agricultural system and an urban system, and it has the least forest. So southernmost, shallowest, warmest, and with that kind of a watershed, we have to get the most sediment, the most nutrients, most pesticides. Those things are going to be exacerbated. You get more of them when you have a severe storm. So if we're southernmost, shallowest, warmest, and we get the most nutrients, then biologically we have to be the most productive. In fact, we produce more fish for human consumption each year from Lake Erie than from the other 4 combined. Now think about the 2 extremes. Lake Superior, the largest. Lake Erie, the smallest by volume. Lake Superior, the coldest. Lake Erie, the warmest. 50 and 2 rule describe the differences. Lake Superior's got 50% of the water and 2% of the fish. Lake Erie's got 2% of the water and 50% of the fish. Where's the water come from that comes into Lake Erie? You'd like to think, in fact, the Maumee, the Cuyahoga River here at Toledo, Cuyahoga River here at Cleveland, incredibly important because of the impact that it had on our government, on our country, really on society when it burned in '69. But 80% of the water that comes into Lake Erie comes out of the Detroit River. And the Detroit River is really a connecting channel between Lake Huron and Lake Erie. 10% is direct precipitation onto the lake itself, and 10% is from the small tributaries around the lake, the largest of which is the Maumee River. Now, keep a couple things in mind. The Maumee River is draining 4.5 million acres of agricultural land. So the Maumee River, in fact, I don't think I have ever seen the Maumee River flow clear. The Maumee River flows pretty brown a lot of the time. Lots of nutrients coming in, lots of sediment coming in. but only 3% of the flow and carrying 40% of the sediment that enters Lake Erie, and that's more than all the tributaries combined put into Lake Superior. So the biggest issues that we're dealing with, these are ones you should be thinking about within your county. What's your role in trying to reduce sedimentation, the amount of sediment coming into the lake, phosphorus and nutrient loading, harmful algal blooms, the aquatic invasive species, dead zone, climate change, and then your work on coastal economic development. When you do it right. Makes a huge difference. Some stats on this lake: it's drinking water for 11 million people. 300 marinas just along the Ohio shoreline. By the way, I'm going to have a lot more information up on these slides than I'm going to be able to go through in this short talk. I already have this talk. It's available on our website. I'll show you where it is so you can go back to any of these afterwards. And Jennifer has indicated that it's already up, or it will be up shortly, on the Cuyahoga County site also. Walleye capital of the world, keep that in mind. 40% of all the charter boats on the Great Lakes are on the Ohio waters of Lake Erie. It's the most valuable freshwater commercial fishery in the world. And when you look at tourism within Ohio, the 8 counties along Lake Erie represent over 25% of the tourism in the state and 117,000 jobs. So historically, you know, we've got the dead lake images of the 60s and the 70s. I'll show you an old picture from then. The lake really became the poster child for pollution problems. And a lot of people ask, what do you mean by that? How can that possibly be? How can the Cuyahoga River burning make Lake Erie the poster child for pollution, or for pollution problems? Well, it was the way that was covered by Time magazine. It came to be the most popular issue, or the most sold issue of Time up till that point. And the very next year, after the burning in 69, you have NOAA formed, US EPA formed, and the first Earth Day. That's why we say Lake Erie was the poster child for pollution problems. Most heavily utilized, most challenging to manage, because none of the other states have as many entities around it. 5 states, a province, and 2 countries. But it's also, and we can't forget this, we went from the dead lake to the walleye capital of the world, so it's the best example of ecosystem recovery in the world. So we have these images from 69. This was actually in many ways overblown, because this was the 5th time the river had burned. But in any event, it's also any time if you spill fuel oil on any body of water or gasoline, it's going to float. However, an awful lot of press. But this ecosystem recovery, this rebirth, also paid off hugely economically. The walleye harvest went from 112,000 fish to over 5 million, 34 charter businesses to over 1,200, and 207 coastal businesses to over 425. Lots and lots of other stats can be added into that. How did we accomplish that reduction? We went a loading of phosphorus. Our models told us we needed to get down to 11,000 metric tons for the whole lake, and we had been putting in 29,000. That's about a 2/3 reduction. Keep that in mind. We targeted phosphorus because it's typically the limiting nutrient in fresh water. And also at that time, keep in mind that the primary source of phosphorus was poor sewage treatment. Today, the primary source is agricultural runoff. Again, we focus on phosphorus, but actually reducing phosphorus and nitrogen would help even more. So keep that in mind as we move forward. Lots and lots of different kinds of algae, well over 100 kinds of algae. Typically, we divide them into 3 groups: the diatoms in cold water, the green algae in the cool water, and then when it's really warm and you get a high concentration of phosphorus, you're going to get some form of blue-green algae, or cyanobacteria is the more correct name, but most people call it blue-green algae. They really don't care where that phosphorus comes from. It can come from sewage treatment, septic tanks failing, lawn care, agricultural runoff. All of those things typically contribute. There's only about 10 species that can bloom. And again, if it's warm, so you're going to have them, we can put in lots of phosphorus, lots of nutrients, and we're not going to have a harmful algal bloom during the winter. But we will get one of these blooms in warm weather if we have a lot of phosphorus and nutrients. So an image up at Stone Laboratory. I'm going to show you a couple other pictures taken right in front of our laboratory right now. And keep in mind that last week when I was up there with coastal county commissioners and mayors. When they arrived at not between 9:30 and 10:30, no algal bloom was present. When we went out on our science crews to literally take them out into the lake and have them collect a bottom sample and a plankton sample and pull a trawl, we were in the middle of a big bloom. It came in that quickly. Moving primarily from the Maumee River, we had a westerly wind, and these are floating forms typically. This is my hand in front of the lab in 1971. This is what Lake Erie looked like. This is my hand in 2010. Notice that it's a different color. It's simply a different species. Between times, phosphorus concentrations went way down. So the walleye capital of the world occurred back in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, the mid-1990s, when we were down at the bottom of this V. And notice that we're back up to where we were in the early 1970s. That's why the blooms have returned. Also keep in mind that on Labor Day, we're going to do a reenactment at Lake Erie, and there's going to be probably several million people watching that on television, and lots of people up there watching all this, and that's a prime time to have a harmful algal bloom in that location. We're concerned about it because these blooms are capable of producing toxins. Microcystis is a common one, but there's 4 that we often focus on, and there's actually more than that. World Health Organization represents 1 part per billion for drinking water, 20 parts per billion for swimming. The highest I'd seen in Lake Erie till 2011 was 60. The highest I'd seen in Grand Lake St. Mary's had been 84 till 2010. Some of you may remember when you heard about Grand Lake St. Mary's being closed in 2010, the concentration had gone over 2,000. Honestly, we'd never seen concentrations that high anywhere else in the country. And also recognize that this is not just a Lake Erie or Ohio problem. This is very much a national problem. It's also an international problem. We've had a number of people die, fortunately not in this country or in Canada, where the blooms are also prevalent, but in South America and in Asia. And the highest I'd seen in Lake Erie had gone from 60 by 2011, when we had their giant bloom, went over 1,200. Now this is some new information that I was able to get from Ohio EPA last week, and essentially you're able to look at a variety of toxins that we think of as common. The red information that you see up there are the 4 algal toxins that we're concerned with, and at the top, that's the most toxic, the most dangerous, moving down. And notice the highest one up there is dioxin. And right under dioxin is microcystis, and down near the bottom, in fact, it's down about 5 from the bottom, is cyanide. The blooms reoccurred in 2002, so in the upper left, that's 2002, just coming back in. Concentrations moving up, the blooms started to reappear. Up and down a little bit, depending on how much phosphorus went in that year, until we get to 2011, down at the bottom. And you see that bloom really got everyone's attention, because that was a giant bloom and it moved into the Central Basin. And also note that in 2012, the bloom was much smaller. That's the bottom in the center. Also keep in mind the image from 2003. We'll come back to that later. That's in the top center. Okay, this is what these blooms looked like in Maumee Bay. This is an area where they'd be the most concentrated. And this is up till 2010, and now I want to show you what that bloom in 2011 looked like. This was 2.5 times worse than anything we'd seen in the past. This is what it looked like from above. Up till 2009, I'd been telling people these blooms are going to gradually move into the Central Basin. We'd seen that occurring, but we hadn't seen anything like this even going back into the 1970s. This bloom moved into the Central Basin and it expanded, and at this point you're covering the water intakes for 2.8 million people. This is what it looked like in the bloom, and this bloom was thick enough that when we hit it with a boat, it slowed you down. We started working with NOAA, Heidelberg, University of Toledo, and we came up with a strategy to forecast the severity of the blooms based on how much phosphorus went into the lake out of the Maumee River from 1 March to 30 June. It's not the only source, but that was a spot that we could monitor using Heidelberg information. We did our first press conference on the 5th of July. So we measured between 1 March and 30 June. On the 5th of July in 2012, we did a press conference, and NOAA tried to release their first ever seasonal forecast of the severity of a bloom later that year. Essentially, we told people that that bloom, because 2011 was the wettest year ever, 2012 was the driest year ever, a drought, the load was very, very low. Load of phosphorus came down. We estimated the bloom would be less than 10% of what it was in 2011. The red square that you see down there is what our estimate was. The green dot within it is what the bloom actually was. So we hit it right on. This is where we are this year. To give you an idea of what we're projecting for this year, we did a press conference on July 2nd, 2013. And essentially we're telling people it's kind of a good news, bad news scenario. Good news is the bloom this year is only going to be about 1/5 of what it was in 2011. The bad news is it's going to be about twice what it was in 2012. And it's going to be pretty evident. Also note that everything I've been talking about is recommendations or forecasts for the bloom in the Western Basin. Blooms in the Central Basin, much more challenging to predict. Because the Western Basin, because it has such a small retention time for water and water flows fast through it, if we can reduce loading into the Western Basin, these blooms will go away. All that load that comes in and all that algae that you saw in 2011 sunk to the bottom and is deposited at the bottom here in the Central Basin. So there's a lot of phosphorus in the bottom sediments of this basin. Keep that in mind because it's critically important. Once it gets in there, it's very hard to get it out. This is what the bloom looked like in 2011. This is what it looked like in 2003. That's what we're projecting for this year. Won't always be in that location because, again, it's going to blow around. We've already had 5 blooms this year in the Central Basin. They're very short-lived when they pop up, but you've had one right here in front of the the Great Lakes Science Center. And we had the first one ever. I spoke last week down at Presque Isle, and there was one in Erie, Pennsylvania, right in the harbor. This is the bloom. The first one I'd seen pop back up in the Central Basin was on July 2nd of 2012. Right off Lake County. It was a large bloom, though, 20 miles wide, 50 miles long. I led a subcommittee for the state within our phosphorus task force to try to come up with targets. We came up with some targets. We're trying to get about a 40% reduction to solve this. That's what you should be thinking about within your county. How can we work together? The primary source is agriculture, but we can't let agriculture do all of this. We have to work together on solving this problem. We all should be thinking about how we reduce our loading by 40%. Scott's has taken it out of lawn care products. That's a real success for us. But lawn care was a small component. The biggest sources are combined sewer overflows and agricultural runoff. Lots of things we as individuals can do. Think about reducing your load of phosphorus, your load of water, really. Reduce the amount of water you send to the sewage treatment plant. That would help a lot. Think about those kinds of things. And also the kind of cleaning products you're using and the kind of lawn care products you're using. And recognize that eliminating combined sewer overflows is going to cost some money. And if we want to solve this problem, we've got to spend it. On the lower left, you'll see our website. If you go to the website, click on Contact and then my name, you'll see a number of talks I've given, and this one should be at the top. And with that, I will stop. Jennifer, thanks very much, and I think we're going to take questions at the end after. Right. Good.
So what I'm going to talk about is the issues at hand, and we need to recognize that some of these issues may be beyond our control, and we need to be careful that we don't try to solve something that we have no control over. On the other hand, there are many problems that have been caused and are a result of human activities, that's good news, because that means we can solve those problems. Well, what are the issues? The issues in Lake Erie here are, as I see it, and I'm going to build on what Jeff has very well presented. First of all, that one of the things is that the lake is getting shallower. The trend is to become more shallow. It is also becoming warmer. It's thermally stratifying sooner and staying thermally stratified longer. What that means is that dead zones, regions of hypoxia, are more apt to occur, and they are occurring regularly now after many years of not recurring. That leads to a decreasing habitat of cold water fish, and that plays into the formation of hazardous cyanobacterial blooms or blue-green algal blooms, especially of Microcystis. Now, and the Microcystis produces the toxins that Jeff talked about. I see those as a combined package, and so I'm going to talk about those together. But I'm also going to talk about other issues that are confronting us. I'm going to talk, and you'll notice that those issues are, as we're starting off in the lake, if we were out in the Central Basin, what's in the box, those are Central Basin issues. As we come in closer and closer to the shore, we confront and come into these other issues. So I'll talk briefly about the invasion of non-indigenous species. I'll also talk about endocrine disruptors and their effect on aquatic wildlife and perhaps on humans. I'll talk also about heavy metal pollution, especially mercury, beach closure advisories, and rivers as areas of concern. So let's talk about dead zones. A dead zone occurs, that's a region of hypoxia, occurs when the oxygen is consumed in the bottom waters faster than it's replenished. Oxygen is consumed faster also in warmer water. So as the lake warms, as those bottom waters become shallower and stay warm longer, the hypoxic zones are more apt to occur. And so for this reason, they are occurring more frequently. Let me show you that in pictures, because I've seen, as a teacher for 40 years, I've seen, well, some people learn it from words. Other people learn it from pictures. Myself, I'm a picture thinker, but I combine here pictures and words. Now, the top of the lake, this is what Jeff was talking about, the top of the lake, or if you really must have it in Greek, the epilimnion. That is formed through the stirring of the top waters by the winds. And so the top will always be about the same as long as the winds are the same. This then shows a water column. So you see the top of the lake and then the bottom of the lake. And the cold water fish habitat would be below that, as shown. Now, what happens if a lake gets shallower? Does it get shallower from the top or shallower from the bottom? Hadn't thought about that. Well, since the forces stirring the top are always the same, the top of the lake stays the same. So when lakes get shallower, they get shallower from the bottom of the lake. What that's saying is, as the lake trends shallower, the habitat for cold water fish is decreased. And this is something we can't do anything about. The reason Lake Erie is getting shallower is largely because of a long-term snow drought in Lake Superior, as well as a long-term rain diminishment, not exactly a drought, but diminished rainfall in the Lake Huron, Michigan watershed. So that's the way it is, and we have to accept that. It may trend back up at some time, we don't know. But what happens if someone tries to solve the problem by putting changing the St. Clair River, as has been proposed? Well, that would slow the water transit out of Lake Huron, Michigan, and that would mean Lake Erie is getting less water. So we would trend down. If Lake Huron, Michigan is trending up as they fix it, we would trend down. I think it is something that behooves us to pay very careful attention to. Now, what if zones of hypoxia occur in this shallower lake? Then you have this, and notice how it has now constrained the habitat for cold water fish. So this is something that, as I see it, is a package deal. I think that we will have a constrained habitat for some of our beloved cold water fish. I'd like to talk about hypoxic zones. What happens in hypoxic zones? Well, this is just a little bit of science I'm going to blast through here. The nitrogen cycle is a function of how much oxygen you have in the water. So when the oxygen is present, notice that nitrogen, all roads lead to nitrate, which is a food for phytoplankton. When the oxygen is out of the water, notice all roads now lead out from nitrate to nitrogen and nitrous oxide. Nitrogen and nitrous oxide are gases, so this is a way of saying that under hypoxic conditions, nitrogen leaves the lake. Let me show you that in pictures. That's a little bit easier to understand. The picture on the right is really how the central basin behaves in the springtime. In the springtime, some nitrogen may enter either through loading or from the watershed, or from some nitrogen fixation by phytoplankton. Phosphorus, under oxic conditions, is stored in the sediments. So this is a good setup for what Jeff talked about in leading to phosphorus limitation of phytoplankton growth. Now, when hypoxic conditions occur, everything changes. And I want to emphasize that. Everything changes. Notice that phosphorus is now released from the sediments, and it's pumped into the higher waters as the lake sloshes back and forth. Also, nitrogen, remember, under anaerobic conditions, all the roads of nitrogen cycle lead out. So now you see nitrogen leaving. Well, what does that lead to? If you're getting more phosphorus being put into the system and nitrogen is leaving, it leads in the direction of nitrogen limitation. Does that really happen? Yes, that is really happening. And this is what the lake looks like late in the season, so that the blooms that are occurring under nitrogen and phosphorus co-limitation, or under some conditions under outright nitrogen limitation. So we need to change this. Can we do something about that? Frankly, we don't know, because we haven't studied it. We haven't studied it because we formed a phosphorus task force. We need to instead form a nutrient task force and study it in an intelligent, scientifically based manner. Well, what about Microcystis? Microcystis is one of the blooms, and you would expect under nitrogen limitation, you'd get a nitrogen-fixing cyanobacterium. Microcystis doesn't do that. So it's rational to ask, why do you have Microcystis? And the answer is, Microcystis depends on certain forms of nitrogen. That is to say, it's not simply that you have nitrogen available as a nutrient, but also what forms of nitrogen do you have. Microcystis is especially favored when you have urea fertilizers, and in our watershed, we do use urea fertilizers. So how much of that do we use? We don't know, because we haven't fully tested it, haven't fully examined that. Also, the production of hepatotoxins, microcystins that Jeff talked about, the toxin is preferentially produced in nitrogen-limited waters. So if we're wondering, well, okay, we have Microcystis, but why would we worry about that? We worry about it mostly because we have the production of microcystins, which are hepatotoxins and also neurotoxins. And it has been found and recently reported earlier this year that the total nitrogen is the best predictor of the toxin production. So we need to focus more. We need to broaden our focus. The ecosystem, we don't have the same old problem that we had in 1972. We don't have the same old problem for the same old reason. We have the same old problem for a new reason that we do not fully understand and need to continue to focus on the role of nitrogen as it is combined with the role of phosphorus. Microcystis looks like this if you look at it in the microscope, but if you look at it with a satellite, and this is an image taken only 2 days ago by the MODIS satellite run by NOAA, you can see that, yes, it is on its way. Might not be able to see it too well, but you can take a look at the slide later. Here is the bloom developing. I'd now like to switch gears and, let's say, come from outright in the Central Basin and start to talk about some other broader issues that really do concern us. In particular, we all know of the threat of non-indigenous species, and the effect that those will have depends on the species. So we have non-indigenous species, the Asian carp, which is a plankton feeder and therefore would greatly disrupt the plankton, the food webs, the plankton-based food webs. We already know that the Drusenid invasion, which is zebra mussels and its congener quagga mussels, they're with us. So if you're wondering, how do we get rid of this problem? The best answer is, in fact, the only answer for a lake this size is don't ever get this problem. So that's why we're working so hard to prevent the Asian carp, the 2 species of Asian carp, from entering these lakes, because once they're here, they likely are here and will radically change our system, just as the zebra mussels and quagga mussels have changed our system. A lot of the reasons we have these changes, we believe, are due to the way in which zebra and quaggas have altered the ecosystem behavior, changing it from a plankton-based system to a benthic-based system. Bythotrephes is a small water flea that disrupts food chains. And just to show you that you can have invaders of all sorts and sizes, I included the hemorrhagic septicemia virus, which causes viral hemorrhagic septicemia in fish. And when we do the genetics on that, we see that the form that we have in the lake has marine genes in it. What that means is it was introduced from a marine system, probably on ship traffic. Other items that we need to begin to take even more seriously than we are now are endocrine disruptors. Things like DDT, PCBs, dioxins, pesticides, so on and so forth. That these can serve both as agonists and as antagonists of natural hormone systems. They disrupt the normal functioning of the endocrine system. They alter, yes, that means they alter sexual performance, and in some cases they change the sex ratio of, for example, in Daphnia, which is a small water flea, zooplankton. Typically, Daphnia have about 10% males in June. They reproduce largely parthenogenically. With the endocrine disruptors, in the presence of endocrine disruptors, they can go up to as much as 40% males. That is to say that the sex ratio can change under the influence of these. They can also alter gender-associated behaviors such as males tending a nest in species. Now, in some species, that doesn't always happen, but in species that don't, where males don't tend the nest, we've now seen that they do. Mercury pollution is one of the persistent problems. It's largely introduced airborne from coal-fired power plants. The major problem with mercury is that it gets buried in the sediments where it's converted into methylmercury compounds. This leads to fish advisories, and overconsumption of mercury can lead to problems, especially neurological problems in humans. Another problem that we are accustomed to hearing about, but why can't we do something about this? Of course we can. Fecal coliform pollution of beaches, largely from CSOs following storms. We know that E. coli can harbor very dangerous plasmids, leading to severe human health problems. And advisories, we can take care of this by providing advisories on the beach. But why couldn't we diminish the number of advisories that we put out? I think that's an entirely reasonable goal. As we look at metrics, why not a metric of having this year fewer beach advisories than last, and so on and so forth. Other items of concern are the areas of concern, rivers, that the tributaries of Lake Erie, where rivers have a number of beneficial uses. But if those beneficial uses are impaired, such as degradation of fish and wildlife populations, so on and so forth, the river is called an area of concern. But if we address those issues and remove those so that the river returns to its beneficial uses, then that river is removed from being an area of concern. We have here in Ohio 4 areas of concern, including the one just down the street. And so this is very much part of our home block here. I'd like to say that some of the ways in which we look at things are, just to put it up in block here, and you can see I've suggested that the problems may be environmental. That is to say, they may affect food webs or may affect habitat loss for particular species and populations. But in terms of moving human behavior, humans change their behavior either when their health can be improved or their wealth can be increased. So human health and wealth are what are motivators of human behavior. So we can see that some of these problems that Jeff and I have talked about do affect human health, some of them potentially very severely, such as the fecal coliform pollution of the beaches. And some of those also can affect our economy. Cleveland, we all know, we all have heard it called the mistake on the lake, but we know it really isn't. It's a place where we can survive and have fun and improve and live our lives productively. So we're here looking at things that can be done, especially the things below this line, and that must be done, not only for our own health, our family's own health, our family's own wealth, the environment around us, but also for the long-term development of this region and for its sustainability for the indefinite future. We must do this, and we can. So I look forward to the discussion through the rest of the day. Thank you very much. Jeff and I have already gotten one question, and the answer is yes. Everything he and I talked about will be on the test on Friday.